Right now, in the United States, there is a renewed argument over deportation, detention, and what governments are allowed to do when they decide certain people no longer deserve the protections of ordinary process. Recent reporting has focused on deportations into El Salvador, including claims from Human Rights Watch that some deportees were forcibly disappeared. Reuters reports on a man wrongly identified as a gang member and deported into El Salvador's Secot prison. Costa Rica agreed to accept deportees from the United States under a new arrangement. That phrase matters. Third country deportees, not sent home, sent somewhere else. Sent into a system they may not know, a legal structure they did not choose. Somewhere responsibility becomes easier to blur. History often repeats. More than 80 years ago, the United States helped carry out a forgotten internment program. Japanese, Latin Americans, people taken from countries like Peru, put on ships, brought to the United States, interned in camps. And then, after the war, many were expelled again, deported twice. History is rarely tidy. Context changes, but methods recur. And one of the oldest methods of state power is this: remove the person from the place where their rights are easiest to claim. Move them across a border, into an exception, into a system where no one is quite sure who is responsible. Human Rights Watch found that some Salvadorans were held without due process, and family members often did not know where they were. Distance is useful to power. Distance from lawyers, distance from scrutiny, distance from the moral clarity that comes when the public has to look directly at what is being done in its name. During World War II, the United States worked with governments in Latin America to uproot people of Japanese ancestry from their homes. The U.S. brought 2,210 persons from 12 countries to the United States. It was an extraordinary reach beyond its own territory. Most Americans know the story of Japanese-American incarceration. Families uprooted, homes lost, citizenship treated as conditional. But behind that familiar history is another one that remains strangely dim in public memory. Japanese Latin Americans were caught in an international system of removal and detention. They were held in Department of Justice camps and intended for possible hostage exchanges with Japan. Civilians reduced to strategic value. Once the paperwork began, that human scale vanished. This story shows how a bureaucracy can convert ordinary people into diplomatic inventory. The mechanics were bureaucratic. Many arrived without visas or passports and were classified as enemy aliens once on U.S. soil. That is the trap. First, remove the person. Then, redefine them. Then, claim the new status justifies the detention. Language like enemy alien or exchangeable does not just describe reality, it manufactures it. The state often needs only a flexible accusation, something broad enough to justify removal before scrutiny catches up. Peru was central. These policies emerge where fear, racial suspicion, and political convenience reinforce one another. Governments begin to see minority communities not as neighbors, but as negotiable objects. Ordinary life becomes vulnerable. The people pushed across borders are often the easiest to forget precisely because they no longer fit neatly into anyone's comforting version of the past. The hostage exchange program was instrumental, calculated. This is one of the darkest habits of modern states, the conversion of identity into leverage. It is not enough to fear people. Power wants to use them. Individual history no longer protects you. The machinery has no natural stopping point. If civilians can be recast as exchange material in wartime, they can be recast as security risks or administrative burdens during any emergency. The wording changes. The temptation does not. Governments create legal voids and pretend they are natural. The very process of removal helped produce the legal condition used to justify detention. Exceptional systems manufacture vulnerability. Then, they treat that vulnerability as proof. No protection, then disposable. When jurisdiction is unclear and timelines are temporary, pay attention. When a government says certain people exist outside the ordinary rules, pay very close attention. That is the sound of a rights system being hollowed out. History is not a spreadsheet. Every number in this story contained a daily life interrupted. public memory first loses texture, the sound of a neighborhood, the rhythm of ordinary errands. Justice becomes manageable through categories and totals. The people inside these systems experienced fear and silence, and waiting in a detention regime is its own form of violence. Waiting to know where you are going, waiting to know who has abandoned you, waiting to know whether law still recognizes you at all. This story is not widely known because it complicates a narrative of wartime sacrifice. Japanese Latin Americans occupied a more fragile place in memory, sitting outside the nation's preferred narrative of who counts when injustice is tallied. These stories show that abuses often happen through paperwork. Quiet systems are often the hardest to remember because they do not leave behind one single iconic image. No defining speech, no courtroom scene, just ships, files, camps, silence. The end of the war did not bring justice. Many were forced to leave the United States, including those whose lives were built elsewhere. Others remained in limbo. First from home, then from captivity. Liberty taken, then the possibility of return taken too. To scramble the meaning of belonging itself is one of the cruelest things a state can do. That damage outlasts policy. It enters family memory. It enters silence. It enters the parts of a life that never fully feel secure again. In 1998, the Justice Department announced a settlement. Qualified class members received an apology and $5,000. Apologies matter, but the amount tells you how states often process guilt by pricing recognition low enough to preserve institutional dignity. Japanese Latin Americans were excluded from the broader redress law because they were not citizens. That technical distinction is the point. Even in apology, the system organized suffering by status, still deciding whose suffering counts fully. This history teaches us how democracies rationalize cruelty. They call it temporary, necessary, security. Above all, they move people where moral responsibility becomes harder to see. Modern offshore routing into third countries follows this same structural logic. Distance is often strategy. A prison farther away, a partner government to absorb scrutiny. Once moved, the burden shifts. Now the individual must claw their way back into a rights framework. Move first, review later. Apologize decades after that. Hidden histories matter because power's first lie is that it is unprecedented. The footnotes say states have done this before. They say borders are used to weaken rights. Once you know that, you hear official language differently. Transfer, processing, custody. All phrases that make violence sound procedural. The danger is rarely just the brutality itself. The danger is how normal it can be made to sound. The story of Japanese Latin Americans is one of the central warnings in modern American history. It shows what happens when race, war, and bureaucracy join forces to translate civilians into strategic value. Displacement engineered through paperwork. Confinement justified through categories. Exile managed through diplomacy. First, they were taken from home. Then, they were taken from the right to belong. Once you see that history clearly, you understand a darker truth about the present. Sometimes the state does not need to erase people completely. It only needs to move them far enough away that the public stops looking. Next time, the United States is fighting over birthright citizenship again. The argument reaches back to Chinese exclusion and the long American habit of asking whether people born here can still be treated as if they do not belong here. Born here, denied here. Because the fight over who counts as American never really ended.